recording this presentation, and I'll put it up on the website in the workplace health and safety area as a YouTube video. We should probably go for about 50 minutes or so. I did this presentation about 3 weeks ago. It went for an hour. I'll try and cut it down a little bit. There's also another YouTube video that's sorry, I've just been given a message here. Sorry, just a technical issue that's come up. Yep, carrying on. There's also another shorter version of this on the website already. It's about 8 minutes worth. So if you've got any staff that wants to have a quick look at what the basic requirements are, it's all a bit shorter and sweeter. So no worries. If you've got any questions, please feel free to type them through to me as we go through this, or at the end of it. Okay, let's go. This is just a standard disclaimer. It's basically saying if I'm leading you up the garden path and telling you the wrong thing, it's not my fault. So okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at an overview to begin with. Basically, what the current situation is in hospitality, specifically hotels, in terms of workplace health and safety. Then we'll in terms of explaining to you what the basic requirements are, or what Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, the regulator, requires you to do. To do that, we need to have a bit of a close look at the Work Health and Safety Act and the regulation of 2011. So we'll go through with a bit of that, what your obligations are, and specifically what the due diligence requirements of company officers are, which is very important. Controlling workplace health and safety hazards and risks, how we do that, and basically on the ground, what you need to implement on the ground, and we'll talk a little bit about Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, and what you don't have on this presentation that you've got a copy of and access to a copy of through the webinar. I've got some photos at the end of this, probably a dozen or so photos of just common sort of hazards that I find when I'm out and about in hotels, just to give you a bit of an idea of what's out there. Okay, the playing field. All right, in Queensland, there's 30-odd work-related deaths each year. In hotels, it's very rare to have a death that's caused by our job. We have many. I say many. There's a number of patrons and guests who die in your workplaces, in your rooms, or in terms of there might be a fight or whatever, and that goes on, but with regarding to workers, it's very rare for that to happen. Of those 30 work-related deaths in Queensland, and as you see there's 200 across Australia, most of those are actually vehicle accidents. The transport industry in particular is probably the highest death rate. We're a low-risk industry, of course. The high-risk industries like construction, agriculture, manufacturing have obviously more serious injuries, although not necessarily all of them have higher injury rates than us. Our injury rates are relatively average in terms of Queensland-wide, in both trading and accommodation hotels, although in accommodation hotels it seems to be a little bit higher for whatever reason that is, just a little bit higher than it is in trading hotels. 50% of our injuries are muscular stress related. That's probably understandable. It's a bit physical. Housekeeping, lugging kegs around, all this sort of stuff. So that's understandable. Manual handling type injuries, or manual tasks as it's called these days, and the rest of the injuries that we receive in our industry are effectively the usual suspects: trips, slips, falls, burns, cuts, things that happen in kitchens, wet areas, etc. Okay. What do I think is the main risk to workers in our industry? It's effectively young people. We employ about 50,000 people in Queensland in the accommodation and trading hotel sector. 70% of the workforce is casual, all part-time. 50% of the workforce are young persons. That's under 25. As a result of that, some things follow through. There's a lack of, in some instances, there's a lack of job ownership because they're casuals. Sometimes there's a lack of maturity because of their age. There's a high turnover in staff, as you would all know. A consequence to that, there's a reluctance from owners and licensees to invest in training, because people come and you spend money on them and then a short time later they shoot through. So you can understand that. There are some ways around that you can address to sort of circumvent that to some extent. And then especially in young males, the 10-foot tall and bulletproof scenario where no keg's too big, and I'm a tough young bloke and I can do anything, and then I hurt myself. So those are all the things, those are all the factors in terms of our workforce, and that to me is what I think is the main risk in our industry. Okay, let's get on to the Work Health and Safety Act of 2011, and you may remember there was a bit of hoo-ha a couple of years ago when this came to be changed. We harmonised our legislation with all the other states, which was a national push, and that came to pass, although not every state has come on board. Victoria and WA have still to do that, but my understanding is that's going to happen in due course. So we changed the legislation. It was effective from 2 years ago, really, or 2.5 years ago, 1st of January 2012. There wasn't that much different with us. We probably had the most up-to-date and modern and contemporary workplace legislation in the country, I thought. So a lot of the terminology and a lot of the things that happen and changed for a lot of the other states didn't actually change for us. And I always used to pick out South Australia as the one that seemed to be, I don't want to use the term backward because some of you people might be from South Australia, but their legislation was pretty old-fashioned. So something like an employer, as it used to be in some legislation, it didn't used to be in ours. It was always called, I say always, certainly over the last 7 or 8 years, was called a person conducting a business or undertaking, and we all refer to it as a PCBU. That's effectively a business or an employer, and a hotel is classed as just as that, as a PCBU, person conducting a business or undertaking. So this sort of terminology we were used to, not necessarily every employer was, but certainly the field in Queensland was used to that sort of terminology where they weren't, and others, and it was all a bit confronting for them. So as an employer, and a PCBU employee, you're obligated to provide duty of care to workers. You would all know that. The major change for us probably was the removal of the WH&S requirement, or the Workplace Health and Safety Officer. And if you will all remember that businesses that employed 30 or more people in Queensland were required to train somebody up as a WH&S or get an employer contractor to do the job. And those training courses were, there were 7 days of training, and it probably cost you about $1,300, and then you train somebody up and they left, and you had to do it all over again. So there were some problematic sides to it and downsides. The upside from our perspective was, certainly from the QHA perspective, was that although not every whoso was effective, many were, and at least it had someone that was looking at the issue, you know, in each establishment, and effectively there was, and more often than not, there was some degree of workplace health and safety happening. Excuse me. I've noticed in the last 2 years that there's been a bit of a falling away, and that's something that was predictable and understandable, but it's sort of fallen away a bit. But, you know, I mean, the reality is the requirements and obligations haven't fallen away. You're still required to meet your duties under the Act, and the best thing to do is, you know, appoint someone, if it's not yourself or whoever, to take some degree of carriage to workplace health and safety. Now, the training isn't probably as readily available as it used to be, but there are training courses around, you know, that are just short courses, that 1 day, 2 days, that can give them a bit of insight. So that's the way to go. If you need to know about those, just let me know and I can point you in the right direction. What are your obligations? Effectively, and you know, this is pretty straightforward, not rocket science, ensure the health and safety of your workers. And you do that, you don't have to do that up to 100%. Like all these things, the terminology that's used is so far as is reasonably practicable. Now that sounds like, you know, a pretty common sense target. That's the qualification in this, so far as reasonably practicable. And there are ways of doing that. You provide a safe working environment, self-explanatory, provide safe systems of work. A safe system of work is just a safe way of doing a task, and just, you know, it could be anything like in a trading hotel, kegs as an example, okay? So how you process the kegs, so they're delivered to your establishment, how do you get them off the truck? Or more often than not these days, there's a machine to do that. How do you get them from the truck to your cool room? It may be downstairs, it may be in a cellar. What you do with them down there, you know, how they're stored, you get double stacking and all this sort of stuff, which is a bit of a no-no. What sort of storage facility is available, you know, and in particular, or one that occurs in cool rooms in terms of you use inert gas to pump this stuff around, you know, are there alarm systems and detection systems and all that sort of stuff. So that's called a safe system of work, and it's safe for the employee as they go about their particular task. The safe, next up, safe use, handling, storage of chemicals. Again, self-explanatory. I think mainly, certainly in our industry, we sort of have lots of chemicals, either cleaning or kitchen related. Also probably related, you know, also cleaning, bare line cleaner. Although those systems are becoming a lot safer, and a lot more technologies used. So you need your staff handling these chemicals, and not all of them are hazardous, and there's fewer hazardous chemicals now being used than ever, because there are other safer ways of dealing with the issue. So, you know, you need to have a safe way for your staff to, when they decant chemicals, and handle them and use them. Provide adequate facilities for workers. There's a code of practice about that. You don't have to worry too much about it, because, you know, that's about construction sites and et cetera, you know, providing water, toilet facilities. The fact of the matter is every hotel has all of those things, so it's not a problem. Provide information, training, instruction and supervision to protect workers from workplace health and safety risks. As you should be doing, you should be providing, and this is where it covers, your induction program, etc., or induction for new workers. You're required to provide safety instructions to your workers through inductions, through safe work procedures, through general information about any hazard or risk that may arise in the workplace. That's what that bit's about. Okay, due diligence. This legislation imposes a duty on officers of corporations or unincorporated bodies to exercise due diligence. So that's, hotels, clubs, etc., etc. And it relates to officers of corporations. An officer of a corporation or unincorporated body is someone like the GM or a licensee at the least, or even a CFO. That particular clause hasn't actually, that I'm aware of, hasn't been tested. So in terms of an officer, and it's a person who makes or participates in making decisions that affect the whole or substantial part of the corporation. So you could think that could go down even further in terms of the due diligence requirement, but I don't think that's been tested in court that I'm aware of. But anyhow, and it used to be just chief executives, but there's a flow-on effect to that. Okay, so in terms of exercising due diligence, you've got to do that to ensure the business meets its work, health and safety obligations, and the legislation tells you how to do that. And here it is: acquire and update knowledge of health and safety matters. Well, in the maroon there, you can see that that's demonstrated. Well, that's exercised by you reading our publications. There's always some workplace health and safety in our newsletter and our review. You may be involved in some seminars or training. You are involved in some training. You're acquiring and updating knowledge of health and safety matters today, doing this. So you're meeting that requirement. And discussions at CEO and at board level on workplace health and safety, and generally in companies there is. You've got to understand the operations being carried out by the business and the hazards and risks associated with those operations. Well, that's a bit self-explanatory or a bit basic. So sort of routinely planning to identify hazards and risks, and information is available to staff about operational workplace health and safety risks. You do that by, having safe work procedures, and we'll talk a little bit about identifying hazards and risks a little bit later on. Ensure that the business has appropriate resources and processes to eliminate or minimise health and safety risks. Yep, implementing a safety management system, which is effectively what your policies and procedures are called in all your businesses. It's a safety management system. It's sort of an interlocking, overlaying system of safety policies and procedures, safe systems of work, etc. Ensure that the business has appropriate processes in place to receive and respond promptly to information regarding incidents, hazards and changes, hazards and risks, and that's about the risk management process, which we'll talk about in a tick as well, and procedures for responding to hazards and risks in a timely fashion. We don't want to get too tied up with this sort of stuff. If you're in a small pub, if something happens and something arises, there's one of the staff finds, electrical issue or whatever, you have a reporting system. They report it to you. You do something about it. I mean, it's not rocket science, some of this stuff. Ensure that the business has and uses processes for complying with duties or obligations under the Act, and that's, auditing. There's no legal requirement for you to do a workplace health and safety assessment or audit of your hotel on an annual basis. It used to be, if you had a whozo, they were required to do an annual assessment. It's not now, but you meet your due diligence requirements by doing that under the Act. So, that's how it works. Let's move on to what your employee obligations are. Effectively look after your own health and safety as an employee, look after their own health and safety. Don't do anything to adversely affect others' health and safety, and I always mention the scenario with apprentices and, in the workplace, and probably 20, 30 years ago it was at its peak where, the new apprentice would get a bit bastardised in the workplace. I mean, that still goes on to some extent. It's lesser of an issue now than it's ever been before, and it's sort of that probably crosses crosses over into a bit of bullying type scenario as well. And there are obviously processes to deal with that, more so these days than ever before. But you know, it's for the employees that are involved in that, you know, they have health and safety obligations, just like management. Comply with any reasonable instruction, and that might be an instruction for them to wear personal protective equipment, you know, gloves, goggles, whatever, when they're decanting chemicals or whatever. That's part of your procedure. That's part of a reasonable instruction, and they're required to cooperate with your health and safety policies and procedures. If you've got a procedure in terms of, and just picking on that for a moment, if you've got a procedure in terms of a staff required to wear personal protective equipment, there's not much point in having a procedure and then ignoring it. That's not the way to go. That's a complete waste of time. So if you've got a procedure and you require them to do that, that's what you should do, and you should enforce it. And you may, and quite a few of you guys are employment relations type staff or managers, etc. HR, you would know that there comes up in the Fair Work Commission from time to time cases about people being sacked for not wearing or not following safety instructions, or not wearing PPE, etc., etc. Whether those are always successful or not, I think it's a bit variable. Control workplace risks. Well, there are inherent hazards and risks in all workplaces, as you would know. And to a large extent, it depends on a couple of things. It depends on the age of your establishment, and it depends on the intent and the focus of management. And older properties in particular, and I'm out there regularly in hotels and doing assessments and having a look around, and the older hotels, there's also, invariably all sorts of issues. And I was just in one the other day, like a 150-year-old hotel or 130-year-old hotel, and and even though they've done their best to mitigate some of this stuff, it's pretty tough when the wiring's 60 years old. There's all sorts of dodgy steps, and the lighting could be better, and and there are lots of leaks here and there, wet areas, and this sort of stuff. So invariably, the older the property, the more inherent hazards and risks that you have to mitigate and spend to rectify. The risk management process this is the Bible, the accepted methodology in how you go about it, what you do. And again, it's not rocket science, so I'm not trying to make it complicated. It's called, in our world, in the OH&S world, or workplace health and safety world, it's called the hierarchy of control, and it's which basically means you either eliminate the hazard or risk, get rid of it altogether if you can, or there are other ways of doing it. You can minimise the risk by substituting the process with something else, something that's safer, and one of those that I've just thought of that comes to mind in terms of instead of using chemicals on pots to clean out pots, there's those the process now where you put the pots in a hot solution, big tub in the kitchen, and sits there for a few days and sorts it out, so you don't have to use those harsh hazardous chemicals. Engineering controls, an example of that is pieces of engineering equipment, and I see a lot of compressors and machines that drive refrigeration machinery and mechanical plant that drives refrigeration in hotels. You need guards on the fans and stuff like that. That's an engineering control, and these things that I'm talking about, as you see on the screen with regards to substitution, engineering controls, administration controls, are in the level you do it. So the last resort's the last one, the personal protective equipment. The highest one, the best to the worst, or best to the least, is starting at substitution. So administration control, that's training safe work procedure, some training on how to do things safely, and as a last resort, personal protective equipment. And as that example I gave before, you don't need the personal protective equipment to clean out the pots if you've got a better process, a better and safer way of doing it. Okay, now let's get on to the guts of it that this is primarily about, as in what the basic workplace health and safety standard is, what you have to do on the ground in your hotel to make your system safe for your employees. So and as I spoke before about a workplace health and safety management system, that's what it's called. That dovetails together. It encompasses all your policies and procedures to manage workplace health and safety risks at work. So what do Workplace Health and Safety Queensland expect you to have if they come and do an inspection on your business, and you don't see them that often because they're fairly reactive, and they'll come and, if there's a serious workplace incident, they'll obviously come out. You see them from time to time, and sometimes they have blitzes on our industry, not that often. They had a bit of a blitz a couple of years ago on what they class as a small business, establishments that employed under 20 people. So it wasn't just, small hotels, but it was a whole pile of businesses, and they inspected in 2 hits 8,000 businesses in Queensland. But it was proactive, and it wasn't a punitive raid on us. It was about just highlighting some areas that you need to look at and have in place, and these are some of them. So develop a workplace health and safety or a work health and safety policy for your business, and most of you would have that, and that outlines what your commitment and your staff commitment is, and generally through the induction process, that's where you should get them to sign off on that. So there's no argument. They know what's required of them. They know what their employee obligations are in terms of workplace health and safety. You need a system that identifies workplace health and safety risks and implements suitable control measures. And how you do that, there's ways of doing that. The best one is to routinely inspect or audit your workplace for hazards, risks and compliance on a regular basis. And I don't mean by every week or every month. I think a three-monthly process where you have something like a formal process where you do this, or one of your managers do this, or the bar manager, or whoever, the operations manager does this. There's a checklist, a template checklist available on our website in the workplace health and safety area, the QHA safety manual. If you have access to that. There's a template there, and you just develop that to suit your own circumstances. So that way you're not only having a look around, and it may be a good idea to use fresh eyes every now and again to do that, because they can pick up different things. Can't see the wood for the trees. It all gets a bit much in a small establishment where you'd think that there's no real requirement for that, or you don't need to do that. But my advice and recommend is that you go through this process and you keep a record on it. Determine and put in place control measures to eliminate or mitigate hazards and risks, as we talked about before, eliminated or substituted or whatever. If it's that high a risk, or if you can't, and sometimes you can't because it's too costly or it's not practicable, you just put in place the best process you can to reduce the risk of injury to your workers. Identify reasonably foreseeable hazards in the workplace, and that could be anything like wet areas, as an example. Well, in every single hotel I've ever been into, there's a wet area, some more than others, and invariably it's in the bar area or around and about the cool room. So you put in place a process to minimise that, and that may be rubber matting or a process where staff are required to clean it up, or regularly, or you get a plumber in to fix the leaks if equipment are leaking, a maintenance person to come and fix the leaks if it's leaking, and every place I go to there are wet areas. As far as reasonably practical to do so. An initial workplace health and safety induction for new staff, and some ongoing training, which you can do at staff meetings, etc. Every new staff member requires an induction about everything and anything, but it needs a workplace health and safety component to it, and just that basic stuff. There's also a template in our Safe Work Manual as well. Invariably, there's obligations in terms of fire and evacuation. You're required to provide some degree of training in terms of evacuation in the first couple of days a person's employed by you, and that's about how to evacuate and where the form-up point is and that sort of stuff. And further down the track, or within a month, you're required to give them a bit more training on the fire system and extinguishers and what have you. But that's one part of it, and you need to go into other areas as well, in terms of things like manual tasks and burns and blah blah blah, all that sort of stuff. Now, what I see out there is there's two parts to this. The first part is sometimes I see too little, or hardly any at all, and sometimes I see too much. Now, we wrote up an induction booklet a few years ago. It's quite a few years ago now, which a lot of people still use. It's on our website. That can be too much. There was about 25, 30 pages of it in a test. I mean, that's good, but the reality is it might be a bit too much for people to take in the first instance. So something like that, you may not need to actually provide them with something as in depth as that in the first instance, but you can give it to them subsequently. Remembering when you start a new job, you provide them with all this guff. Not only workplace health and safety, but everything else. And in this day and age, as you all know, you've got to tell them everything and anything. And there's that much guff to read, and they just, it may not stay in. So I reckon, from a workplace health and safety perspective, it's about quality, not quantity. And I reckon if you've got half a dozen pages on this sort of stuff, with the good gear, you're home and hosed. A reporting system for work health and safety issues, and most hotels have got that in terms of incident books, or an incident form, which are filled in and passed up the chain and responded to. Consultation process that involves staff and work health and safety. WH&S are hot on the consultation process, involving staff and working out workplace health and safety issues you might have in the workplace, or getting them involved. And that's where, and most of you guys would have regular staff meetings, or certainly they would be involved with staff meetings with sub-managers or supervisors, etc. That's where you can involve them and bring up from time to time workplace health and safety matters. Develop and implement safe work procedures for activities that pose a potential injury risk to your staff. Like having a procedure for moving beer kegs. Don't lift them on your own. If you use a keg lifter if you've got one. Use a keg trolley if you've got one. Don't lug it about. You can roll them on the bottom edge. That's safe. You need a procedure that they can have a bit of a look at. Certainly when they are first involved in that sort of task. Not everyone who works in a hotel does that sort of thing, but the people that are need to know how to do it safely. So there are also some draft ones on that Safe Work Manual, and a lot of you would already have some of these anyway. Develop a register of hazardous chemicals for the workplace. You're required to do that under the regulation, and all that is to be every time when you get wholesale hazardous chemicals delivered to you, they come with a safety data sheet. It used to be called a material safety data sheet. It's now a safety data sheet. You need to put that in a folder somewhere, call it a register of hazardous chemicals, list all the hazardous chemicals you have with the safety data sheets, because the safety data sheets tell you what to do, if there's a spill or if you have an accident, what's in the chemical, if you're concerned about what's in there. All the nasties, that'll tell you. So, and that needs to be located somewhere near where you are actually operating, where the people, your workers, are operating. So you'd have them in your chemical store for a start. If you've got separate chemicals stored in the kitchen, you might have them in the kitchen as well. Ensure that an adequate number of workers are first aid trained and have access to persons who have been trained to administer first aid. That's a direct quote from the regulation. So you're required to have an adequate number of workers first aid trained. Well, what's an adequate number of workers? Well, that's all dependent on your industry and your workplace, and it means different things to different people. If you're a business that operates 9 to 5, you would want an adequate number of people to cover, and that adequate number might be 1 or 2. With us, we're shifts. We're shift workers, all of us, all of our venues. So the code of practice recommends, it doesn't tell us exactly what we're required, but it recommends 1 person trained for every 30 workers. Now that's, again, it's all dependent. If you're on a construction site, it might be different. My advice is, if you can have shifts covered by someone that's first aid trained, all well and good. The training has been reduced. You remember, it used to be the senior first aid course was a 3-day course. It's now, 2-day course. It's now been reduced to 1 day. There's a 1-day course with a bit of pre-reading, I think it is, that meets this requirement. So it doesn't cost anywhere near as much as it used to. That's the way to go. Certainly, I guess out of normal hours would be the time that you really probably need someone that's first aid trained. During the day, I'm not saying you can get away with it, but it's probably a bit easier. And the other thing too is, if you're next to a hospital, well, you don't have to do any of this because you've got access to persons who have been first aid trained. Anyhow. Prepare, maintain and implement an emergency plan. You would all have that. If required, inspect, test and tag on a 12-monthly basis. This is the service industry, which is our standard, any portable electrical equipment. And a lot of you would have heard of this testing and tagging business. It's more applicable to older properties. If you've got in your electrical circuits, and certainly modern day electrical circuits have safety switches on them as part and parcel of the circuit. So any modern hotel would be covered completely by safety switches. If your whole workplace, your whole business is protected by safety switches, you don't have to inspect, test and tag. And the testing and tagging is not everything that's electrical. It's portable electrical equipment. It's electrical equipment that's designed to be moved in its use. So it'd be a hairdryer, it'd be a vacuum cleaner, it'd be an electric knife. Those are the sort of things you have to inspect, test and tag on a 12-monthly basis in our industry. If your workplace doesn't or isn't covered by safety switches on all the electrical circuits. Now, a lot of hotels I go to, certainly pubs in particular, or trading hotels in particular, have safety switches, but not everywhere. Over periods of time, they've had various circuits upgraded, and every time a circuit's upgraded, there's a safety switch put in. But that they would still require to do this because all their circuits aren't covered, and with portable electrical equipment it could be taken and used in a different circuit. So that's the story. Ensure that any asbestos at the workplace is identified by a competent person and develop a management plan. If most of you people that are in an older property would already know that and have that in place. And there are a lot of old hotels that have asbestos, and asbestos is fine if it's sealed in. So if it's painted and fine, looked after, no problem. But certainly you have to have a management plan there. So if you've got workers coming in to doing some work in that particular area, they need to know that it's asbestos, and they take certain precautions when they're working there. In terms of health and safety representatives and workplace health and safety committees, these are only required or only mandatory if requested by workers. So we in our accommodation hotels in particular, we have quite a few workplace health and safety committees. And I endorse that and support that. We should have workplace health and safety committees, and we have people that call themselves health and safety reps, and that's fine. You can do that. But a health and safety representative, a proper one, if that's the word to use, an official one, is one that's been requested by your workers and has been elected by the workers. And if they want to be trained, you've got to pay for the training. That's an official health and safety representative, as opposed to just someone calling themselves a health and safety representative. And you can have either or, depending on what you want to do and what's requested by your workers. If you've got a committee, you need an official committee that's requested by workers. You need 50% of the committee comprised of the workers. So workers have to have 50% representation. If none of this is official or requested by workers, you can have whatever you like sort of committee, and you can call them whatever they like. No worries. Safety culture. This is what it's all about in your workplace. You drive the safety culture in your workplace. So it's you that has to have ownership. You have to lead it, and your workers, and you have to get your workers on board. And staff consultation in that process is important, because it provides them and it gives them some degree of ownership, and you need to be consistent with it. It's all driven by you. Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. Okay, as I said before, they're more reactive than proactive. Sometimes conduct random inspections. They're a lot better to deal with now than ever before, and again, I'm more happy to help you if you've got an issue, a problem that you might want to sort out. My advice is to ring me first, but you know, you may want to have some dealings with them. You know, I mean, like any sort of organisation like that, the fewer dealings you have with them, the better, in my view. But certainly ring me if there are any issues, but they are better than they used to be. Sometimes it's unavoidable, so if one of your workers injures themselves, you're required to report it to Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. There's a form, it's on our website. There's a particular form, basically the minimum. There are some other things, but the minimum criteria is if your worker is admitted to hospital as a result of injury as an inpatient. So if they go to hospital, get treated, and they aren't admitted to hospital as an inpatient, you don't have to report it to Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. Interestingly enough, sometimes they find out about these things, and there was a case not so long ago in Cairns where a worker injured his eye and was taken to hospital, and the hospital got in touch with Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, although the guy wasn't admitted as an inpatient. So they knew about it, you know, instantaneously. But anyhow, you know, I guess that's the sort of scenario. And the hotel rang me, and I rang Workplace Health and Safety Queensland and said, what's going on here? This guy hasn't been admitted as an inpatient, so we're not required to submit the form or tell you about it. So that was that. So that's the go. In terms of investigating, they'll investigate a serious incident, and they'll, you know, more often than not, will only be on your property if there's a serious incident happening, and they've got the powers to search and seize and do a whole range of things, and all you do It's like any sort of official investigation involving those sorts of people, or the police, or OLGR, or whatever. You just, you know, be as nice as possible to them, and cooperative generally. What can happen to you if something goes wrong, or if they come and do an inspection and find things wrong? Not that much happens, actually. Unless there's a death or a serious injury, you invariably won't be prosecuted. You'll either be given, for basic stuff, you're given an improvement notice, and so you're given, 10 days to fix it, and then they toddle off, and you've got half a dozen of these, and you fix it, and then you get in touch with them and tell them that you fixed it, and they're happy with that, and more often than not won't come back to see whether you fixed it or not. Next step up is a prohibition notice. So that's them saying, you're not going to do this anymore. This is it. Cancel. Find another way. And that's the end of that. Enforceable undertaking is a scenario where a major company is usually have had some serious breaches. So instead of prosecuting, they say to the major company, well, you give us $50,000 as a nominal fine, or whatever it might be, and you'll be required to undertake this particular training and introduce this particular process. So it's go away money. Effectively, that's one way of doing it. Or worst case scenario, they'll prosecute. And there are 3 categories of penalty. I've just got it here. From really serious to middlingly serious to not that serious. They're the maximum penalties for corporations for Category 1 that exposes an individual to the risk of injury or death is $3 million. For individuals as a business or an officer, $600,000 or 5 years jail. Others $300,000 or 5 years jail. So they've got these huge penalties if it all goes belly up, which it doesn't very often. So we were talking before about what the hazards are, and we've spoken pretty well about that. Personal security is an issue in terms of armed robbery, and you need to provide your staff with some degree of training. Certainly you should have some procedures. And invariably most of you will have that. Kitchen hazards, electrical safety, kegs and cool rooms, emergencies, so let's go through just a few of these pictures, the stuff that I see and all that sort of stuff. So we've got inert gas bottles here, CO2 or whatever, nitrogen, and these aren't chained up. They really should be chained up, because if they fall over they may leak, and CO2 asphyxiation does happen, and people die. And there was a bloke died in Victoria last year because of it in a cellar. So these are the sorts of things that happen. You'll see the double adapters are a no-no anymore. They're illegal in some industries. They're not illegal in our industries yet, but I guess they will be in due course. As you would probably know, they don't have themselves have cut-off switches like a power board does. So they get hot, boof. And that all looks a bit old and dodgy. That's a no-no. And hazardous chemicals down here, and I think the reason that photo's in there is because it's mixed with food. There's some food stuff, oil and things. And you may recall an incident out on the Gold Coast last year at a restaurant where some lady had a shocking case of the hiccups, and a staff member said, I know that, we'll fix that, and ran out the back and found a container with, I don't know, whatever it was, vinegar or what they thought might be in it, and brought it back, and she took a swig, and it was some toxic chemical because it wasn't labelled, and it was mixed in with the food and stuff, with the chemicals. So that's the sort of stuff that can happen. Another thing about that is spray bottles need to be labelled. An incident in a hotel last year in Brisbane where some new person started. I pressed that. Where a new person started, didn't know what was in it, thought it was some sort of cleaning agent, but it wasn't. It was flammable. Sprayed it on a top, cooktop, and poof, got burnt, had to go to hospital. So it happens. Middle picture, this doorway is to be kept clear at all times. Yeah, sure. Next doorway, fire safety door. Do not obstruct, do not keep open. Yeah, sure. And obviously the doors are closed because it stops the smoke and what have you getting through and the fire spreading. Electrical cabling, yeah, there were power boards there, that's the positive, but this stuff's all over the place. Trip over it, you know, hurt yourself, no good. The middle one on the right hand side there, that's in a cellar, and that's hanging on that cable, and that's pulling it out. So that's obviously a bit dodgy. Double stacking of kegs, generally a no-no to stop these young blokes from doing it, but if you're going to do it, you need either a keg lifter or you can have a dual lift. That's the only way to do it. So if you're dual lifting them, if you're dual lifting them, no problem. Invariably, there's never enough room. You know, it's very rare I go into a place and there's enough room. There's hoteliers complaining all the time, never enough room, and there isn't. More electrical stuff here, yeah. What that indicates probably is there's not enough power points. So an electrician will sort that out, put 3 power points in, and Bob's your auntie. I find this in a lot of walk-in freezers. There's and it's probably because it's not sealed properly, and it's very hard to have them sealed properly, and a bit of air gets in and the moisture comes down, and that's actually ice, and ice builds up on the metal plate. That happens, I see that a lot. So you've got to get the dishy to pour some hot water over it every morning or whatever. Sometimes there's a way of fixing it and sometimes there's not. It's a slip hazard. Left hand side, that's a fire exit, so don't store rubbish in your fire exit. The fireys won't like it, and it's not the way to go. If you're out in a hurry, you can see that's a bench, and that's a little bucket holding the bench up, and that would be, you know, you've got, you imagine, you know, a pot of hot water or oil or something on top of that. Stacking of product. The recommendation is not more than shoulder height. That can be a bit harder to achieve. A, B, different people are different sizes. If you are stacking higher, you need to have a set of steps there available in the cool room for staff or for customers as well. Some people draw a line along the wall as to that's the cutoff. If you've got a set of aluminium steps or a step ladder or whatever, it needs to be industrial rated. There's an industrial rating and a domestic rating. It needs to be industrial rating. So have a look at your ladders in particular in your premises to have a look and ensure that they are. This is fire escape. You know, obviously dodgy, and we're up one floor there, so even worse. This is just a electrical cord extension lead. Instead of having a proper waterproof power point, they're just joined together and a bit of tape put around it. Water will get in there, cause a problem. Steps, trip hazards. That's at the front entry into a bottle shop. That'll, you know, people will trip over that. So we've got a bit of everything here. Caustic soda, rat and mouse killer. It's like in a laundry. I think I'm probably highlighting that to say, well, you really need that would be part of your chemical hazardous chemical register, and it probably needs to be a bit tidier than that. This one up here, yeah, trip hazard. That's in a little restaurant, a pub restaurant. Trip over. This is not so much of a problem if it's handled okay, but that's a heavy container of cooking oil, and you put it up high, and that's fine. Well, I say fine. I mean, if it drips down on there, I guess that's not going to be too much of an issue, but just putting it up there and bringing it down is a really heavy task, so there might be a better way of doing that. Housekeeping, again, there's never enough room. Crap everywhere, needs to be sorted. And that's probably a pretty good indicator, and I see that sort of stuff a lot, and I see it a lot in pubs. and all the cabling might not be electrical cabling per se, but a lot of it will be. But there's power boards 1, 2, 3 bits and pieces. I'm sure there'll be a double adapter there somewhere. Again, that indicates a couple of things, and one being that there needs to be more power points there. Okay, reached the end of the line. Thanks very much for your attention. If you've got any questions, you can ask them. Haven't been too many questions coming yet, so I must be explaining myself all right. Again, just those basic things that you need that we spelled out. If you've got those in place, and I'm sure most of you will have, you'll pretty well meet any sort of requirement that Workplace Health and Safety Queensland will have of you. If they come and inspect, invariably they will always find something wrong, because always there is. But if you've got these things in place, it won't be anything serious. Okay. Yep. I have. I'll email you guys what that is. I just have to look it up and give you some referral. A couple of organisations, National Safety Council of Australia in particular, do some good short courses. I'll let you know that. No worries. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you all soon. Any queries, email me, send in, whatever, ring in, no problem. Don't forget the Safe Work Manual as it's there. It's got everything known to man, but don't let it feel too onerous, because you don't actually have to have everything, and there's a lot more information in there than not that's necessary, but I've extrapolated a bit. No worries. Talk to you all again. Cheers.